We slide into our seats right before the bell in a world that has normalized violence, especially against youth.
What roles do we play in creating the conditions in which our youth live, play, and learn?
We attend schools that have stood in the corner aimlessly sharpening their pencils as catcalls and rape jokes and teen dating violence have intensified within their own hallways.
What responsibility is ours to own when our youth are suffering? When they tell us that the very violence we are working to prevent has and continues to root itself in the hallways they grow up in, that it isn't going away, that it's getting harder. It's February. Earlier this month, the Centers for Disease Control released its latest iteration of the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. The statistics have swept nearly every major headline, telling the same story. Youth in the U.S. need our action. They're battling hopelessness and despair. They're experiencing more sexual violence. And for girls, LGBTQ students, many students of color, and students whose families are struggling economically, it's even harder. The stats are hard to take in. But for those of us working in the anti-violence field, they're not that surprising. It's February. Earlier this month, youth activists and organizers took to the steps of the California state capitol to call adults to action to end teen dating violence in their schools and communities. 6 days before the YRBS survey hit headlines, they already knew what the problem was. They spoke to the very issues that shocked us less than a week later. They didn't need data about the state of our youth because they're living it.
What do you think happens when youth feel alone, have low self-esteem, or never feel good enough? What do you think happens when youth constantly seek out the validation of others or constantly try to change themselves for other people? What do you think happens when youth get all of their information about relationships from platforms that team with predators or display content that romanticizes sexual violence? What do you think happens when all of the previous happens, but there's no one or nothing to stop it?
Data plays such a valuable role in advancing this movement. It helps to tell the stories of our communities. It sways those in power to direct dollars and time and people to making things better. But when so many of us are shocked by information about the communities we are trying to help, and when those communities say they already knew, but no one listened, the data tells a different story, that there's a disconnect.
Preventing teen dating violence means so much to me, not only because I am a survivor of it, but because it's so important to continue advocating for the youth that need our help and have our community be aware that it's real and it's happening right now.
Over the next 4 months, Prevent Connect is diving deep into youth engagement, exploring how organizations across our movement are centering youth voices in their fight to end gender and power-based violence, and how that work is transforming their agencies and their communities. For our first installment, I'm sitting down with Arman, Maya, and Anna, 3 of the youth activists from the Orange Day rally in Sacramento, California earlier this month. They all serve on the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence's Youth Advisory Board and join dozens of activists across the state to call on their legislators and influential adults to do more in schools. They're sharing why this movement means so much to them, what it's like to work with the state coalition, and what advice they have for organizations who want to bring youth into their work. We're tackling ageism, authentic engagement, effective strategies, and where youth want us to be putting our focus in our prevention work. In the first episode of our youth engagement mini-series, coming up on Prevent Connect. You're listening to Prevent Connect, the podcast bringing together voices from across the movement to end gender and power-based violence to give you the tools to practice primary prevention in your daily life and at work. We're highlighting emerging research, promising strategies, and stories from on-the-ground prevention practitioners doing this work in new and innovative ways. Bringing you topics like foundational strategies to prevent violence, primary prevention, critical race theory and school climates, prevention in a digital age, and more. All coming to you each month wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm your host, Janae Sargent, and this is Prevent Connect. Oh my gosh, well, thank you all so much for hopping on the podcast with me. I'm so excited about this. I've been excited about this since Orange Day. So many of my colleagues, I unfortunately wasn't able to be there in person. I caught the recording and it was amazing. And that day I was hearing from so many colleagues who were there talking about how incredible it was. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have to talk to these people. If we're going to do this podcast series, I have to talk to these organizers. So thank you for being here. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, doing awesome.
Same here.
Cool. Well, let's just jump right in. Can you tell us who you are, where you're joining from?
Yeah, my name is Arman Sharma. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm joining from Fremont, California in the South Bay area.
I'm Anna Campos, pronouns she, her, and I'm joining from Orange County, California.
And I'm Maya Henry, pronouns she, they, and I'm from Los Angeles.
Awesome. Thank you all. So I really, we're going to talk about Orange Day and about the planning that went into that and about what you shared with legislators. But I'd love to hear a little bit about each one of you first. How did you get to become involved in the movement to end gender and power-based violence?
I can start. I feel like there's three main reasons how I got involved in the movement. The first is I'm a people person, so I've always been interested in learning how to foster healthy relationships for myself and for others as well. And through that, I've had so many important people in my life around me, including my mom, my aunt, my cousin, and even a few friends enter into the field of prevention through organizations such as SAVE or Safe Alternatives to Violent Environments, and NARCA, which is another organization in this field, which centers around cultural responsiveness. And I guess second, seeing how many people around me became involved in this line of work, it just became more and more apparent to me that intimate partner violence was a severe problem, which many struggled with or were likely to struggle with. And me specifically being a Gen Z teen in the Bay Area could see that just how much the mental health crisis has played and is continuing to play a role in teen dating violence in some way or another, and B, just how much social media and media in general was influencing relationships, either by giving distorted perceptions of what healthy relationships look like, or plain out fostering predators or romanticizing sexual violence. I feel like the field of intimate partner violence prevention and intervention is pretty gendered, and there's little engagement from boys or men especially, which is problematic because intimate partner violence is a problem that affects everyone, and it's wishful thinking to believe that a problem with engagement from some can be fixed for everyone. And additionally, you see a lot of times that LGBTQ plus boys or men experience higher rates of intimate partner violence too. So it's really this very intersectional issue that we need engagement from all and diversity within to have any chance of ever solving it.
Oh my gosh, thank you for sharing. 1000% agree with you. I'm so glad that you're here.
The main reason I was involved in the movement was because I was a part of a toxic relationship that led to domestic violence, and I thought it was, once I got out of it, it was really important to advocate not only for myself but for the people that can't advocate for themselves, and just help the teens around me, because I know there's way too many that need it.
Thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that.
Similar to Arman, I kind of got my start in doing a lot of advocacy for queer and trans rights and queer and trans people, specifically through my school and through the GSA network. And then as I learned more and more about the issues facing LGBTQ plus people that weren't just political, but also social issues, that's when I started to learn more and more about the higher rates of intimate partner violence that we experience. And from there, that's when I kind of was like, okay, if I'm so passionate about gender equity and about queer liberation, I think it only makes sense to also try and work and address an issue that plagues both of those communities and both of those fights. And that's kind of how I started learning more about teen dating violence and violence of all kinds.
We're going to talk more about that later, because I think what all of you have shared already is that piece on anti-oppression work and intersectionality, and that we need to be working for all and not just a few. And I think there are a lot of people in the field who can still learn from that. So I'm really excited to dig into that. Before we do, it sounds like you're all joining from different parts of the state, which is really interesting to me because you're all on the same youth advisory board with the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence. How did that happen? How did you all get to be working on Orange Day and linked up with the partnership?
For me, one day, I think it was maybe November, my youth advisor for Team STYT, which is the youth group that I'm a part of from the parent organization SAVE. STYT stands for Stronger Than You Think, by the way. Basically, this advisor sent out an opportunity to join just this 1 hour focus group section for the partnership's teen dating violence prevention and awareness campaign. And I had been engaged with the work of SAVE and STYT for about a year at this point. So I thought if I could be of any use or help in any way, that there was absolutely no harm in joining this. Yeah, I guess one meeting led to another 5. And just like that, I was like speaking at the Capitol for the Orange Day rally. So
yeah, and basically the same story, but I'm part of Laura's house, and we have a youth club at our school, and the president, Randy Zuckerman, which was also another youth speaker at the Capitol, she had sent out on Remind that this opportunity was there for us, and if we wanted to learn more about it, we could totally join. And I wanted to get more involved, and I wanted to get more information for myself and for other people. So I thought, why not? And boom, speaking at the Capitol a few months later.
Honestly, I have to say my story is pretty much the same as both of you. Over the summer, I got really involved with this amazing prevention center in Los Angeles called Peace Over Violence. And I did an internship with them, learned all about teen dating violence and prevention work, got super interested in it. And then I think I got a text maybe like a month after the program ended, and it was like, hey, like if you want to go on this focus group, here's the link. And I was like, oh sure, why not? And then, like both of you said, one thing led to another, and then it was like December, and they were like, hey, if you want to go to the Capitol, we'd love to have you. And I was like, well, I'd love to go to the Capitol. So then we were there.
This all sounds very casual. Like I was in a meeting and then they asked if I wanted to speak at the Capitol, and I was like, sure. And maybe because I'm a nervous person by nature, I'm like, no, I don't think that's how I would react immediately. How was that? So when they asked you, were you like, yes, absolutely, I'm so in ASAP? Were you nervous? Were you like, did you need to prepare? I mean, walk me through what was going through your head when you were asked to go to the Capitol.
it was pretty casual, I would say. I mean, it wasn't exactly like that, but like they were in an email that they sent out after one of the meetings. They said, hey, if any of you want to speak at the Capitol, just let us know. And I was like, this sounds like an amazing opportunity, and I could like share my own perspective about teen dating violence, and everyone would be there to listen. So I was like, yeah, definitely. I do think when I got closer to the actual date, when I was working on my speech, when I was actually like, preparing to speak in front of all these people, it definitely got like a little more nerve-wracking. But I mean, before then, it just seemed like a phenomenal opportunity to me.
I like totally agree. It was pretty casual because it was sent in the meeting, and it was just like casually brought up, like, oh, if you want to speak. And I'm a pretty like outgoing person and like people person, so I was like, yeah, why not? And I love public speaking, so I was not really that nervous. I think it's cool. I was a theater kid, so nerves went away. So yeah, it was a little nerve-wracking the day of, but besides that, it was pretty cool. It was pretty chill.
Yeah, I have to say I agree. I think that at first, well, before I was, having to think about the logistics, I was like, oh, this will be great. And then as I was starting to like write my speech, and also as I was starting to realize like, oh wait, I'll be missing 2 days of school, which normally would be fine, but it just happened to be that, of course, the day that I was missing, I had like a really big presentation due for one of my classes, and it was like a team presentation. And I was like, okay, so I'm gonna have to like email the teacher and beg to get it moved and all of that. And it ended up being fine. But I think just for me as someone who like definitely probably takes school a little bit too seriously, I was like, wait, like when they say it's on a Monday, or Tuesday, excuse me, that means it's like actually on a Tuesday. But I think overall, I felt like very comfortable with everyone, even though we'd only really met through Zoom prior to Orange Day. And so even though it was kind of just by email and there were a lot of logistics, I was like, oh, it'll be fine because it's these people who I've been talking about these topics with for a month. So it was, yeah, it was stressful, but I also was a theater kid. So, I've said weirder things in front of people.
I'm a theater kid. Looks like all of us are theater kids.
Okay, I wasn't a theater kid. Maybe this is the problem. I gotta tell everyone to just do theater. I was a journalism kid, a newspaper kid. So maybe that's why I would have gotten nervous. So I know the three of you are on the partnership's youth advisory board. And, I have to say we're doing this podcast series because we often get asked from people in the field working at organizations like what you're all working with in your communities, how to engage youth. And the answer is both so simple and so complex. And there are so many different programs that people can offer. And I think Youth Advisory Board can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So can you tell me a little bit what do you do with the partnership? What kind of comes along with being on that Youth Advisory Board?
What I would say we did a good amount of was not only kind of talking about our own experiences with teen dating violence and especially teen dating violence education, but really work on just like how to better the curriculum that is out there. I think all of us have had, we've had different rallies at our school, we've had different assemblies, maybe we've had people pass out buttons and pins, but we were all kind of talking about, okay, when someone comes to our school and is trying to send this overall message of maybe don't do drugs or never drink and drive, or in this case, here's really important information about teen dating violence and red flags. Like what makes that effective versus what makes it where everyone just is on their phone throughout the whole assembly. So it was a lot of talking about, okay, what do we wish that we had seen when we were in middle school or even a few years ago when like entering high school? And then also, what are certain topics that aren't talked about enough? I think a lot of us brought up like the queer and trans experience, how that's often not talked about, how oftentimes any language about teen dating violence can be extremely gendered, which I think detriments everyone involved, things like that. So it was a lot of kind of working towards, as people who have received versions of this curriculum and who will continue to receive hopefully better versions, how can we make sure that what's getting put out there is the most accurate, most effective thing possible?
Yeah, I definitely mirror a lot of what you said. Someone coming from an extremely small school, we've actually not had, we've had little to no engagement about anything in the field of, teen dating violence prevention, rallies, seminars, none of it was at my school. So I definitely think working with the advisory board was an amazing experience because I got to hear so much from other youth activists who each have their own perspectives about how to approach the issue of teen dating violence and prevention in terms of prevention and intervention. And I've learned so much from the partnership staff as well, who they're amazing. They're all very knowledgeable in terms of intimate partner violence prevention and intervention, and are just so supportive and empowering. They're the reasons that I was able to speak at the Capitol or here. And in terms of what we talked about or worked on, I definitely mirror a lot of what Maya said. Additionally, I think some of the things that we did, maybe more of the logistics, but still important, worked on messaging for Orange Day and helped, make sure that we had a consistent goal and narrative. But then also some of those more bigger narratives, how discussing approaches to prevention for youth and adults. And through that, we helped create a guide for youth activists who want to help prevent teen dating violence but don't exactly know what steps to take.
Yeah, I agree with everything they said because they basically got it all. On school's curriculum, like Maya said, that it needs to be more talked about because it's really a topic that's thrown under the rug and is embarrassing for schools to admit that it's happening at their schools. And due to that, it's just happening even more because they're not getting the right help or the resources to just put an end to it. And I think that's what we were talking about and how we could get the curriculum and the school more involved and get the community involved as well.
One more thing to add to everything that was just said is you see this problem continuing in colleges and universities. You see them at much higher rates, especially as well. So I feel like the best way we can ever have any chance of preventing it in the first place is through bettering high school curriculum, because obviously it's not working if we still see it continuing at such high rates later in life.
I hear you that you got a lot from working with the partnership staff. I can pretty much guarantee that the partnership staff got a lot from working with you. I think oftentimes we think if there's a degree attached to your name or a certain age or something like that, then you know more about a certain thing. And that's really not the case. And especially when we're talking about teen dating violence, it makes the most sense that you all know what's happening in your schools. Like I could not speak. I have a general idea, but I could not speak to what's happening in schools right now. And I think this is really important because so what I do, I work with organizations across the country doing prevention work, and we're seeing a push to leave the schools because people get a lot of pushback. And so a bigger push to do more community-based work. And it sounds like you all got linked up through your programs, through community-based work, but it sounds to me like you're like, no, schools are where it's at. Like you have to be doing stuff in schools. Could you tell me a little bit more about this? I know that wasn't a question that we had planned, but that just feels like such an important point. I would love to get your thoughts on it.
Yeah, definitely. I am very sad to hear that, because I mean, someone who comes from a school where there is no prevention work, it's always been like it's so small. It's always been like something that I've regretted because I mean, prevention work, you need prevention and work in school because no matter how many community programs you have, the best way to reach youth is through schools. That's where everyone is. That's where everyone will know about it. I mean, there's like one other person in my school or two who have been involved with my like community organization, but that's two people compared to everyone. Like you can address everyone in schools, and that's where you really have the most reliable audience as well, where they're going to listen to you. They kind of have to listen to you. So I definitely think you need to have curriculums in schools, and it's it's a shame that that's like being underfunded and that's just kind of thrown under the rug, like Anna said, because for example, like with my organization, like Save, we have like they had a very robust prevention program and funding got cut and they were not able to reach a lot of the schools that they were able to before, like thousands of kids in like public schools in our area, and that's just super important because like our presentations are good because like we have youth summits called Symbiosis once a year. That's what my youth group mostly plans. And we have a healthy relationships presentation where we talk about, we introduce the concept of teen dating violence, but then we focus on relationships, how to foster healthy relationships, not only in intimate settings, but with friendships and things like that. What are some red flags? What are green flags? How to help friends, etc. And it's like this very condensed presentation for you to learn more about teen dating violence generally, to learn more about relationships, how they can enter like with the proper support, with the proper foundation to like have a successful relationship. And that's just so important, but it's just not prioritized at all. And I'm thinking like how much a simple presentation could do if you have it in schools, if you like appeal to these thousands of youths that you can.
I could not agree more. I think for me, and we've seen cutbacks of so much critical education. We've seen critical race theory get cut. We've seen education about queer and trans rights, or not even trans rights, trans history and queer and trans existence get cut. We're seeing prevention work get cut. And I think to me, what's most frustrating is like, we all know that just because you don't teach someone something doesn't mean it doesn't happen. Just because you don't talk about racism doesn't mean racism isn't engraved in every aspect of life. Just because you don't talk about teen dating violence doesn't mean that 1 in 3 people will likely experience it as teenagers. Like, it doesn't work like that. And I think community-based action is great. It's amazing. Peace Over Violence, which is the organization I'm representing, does a lot of community-based action, and it's crucial. But with that being said, schools are the place that like students go to learn and go to become better people. And it's also a place that they're mandated to be every day. And when we get rid of education there, we're kind of just hoping people will voluntarily sign up for something that's not really a fun conversation. When we have the option to talk about this incredibly like necessary issue in schools where it's impacting everyone in that room, it's impacting all the teenagers, like that is the best possible way to talk about teen dating violence. Because when you're talking about it in a community, while it's amazing and while it can make change, you're not necessarily talking to the people who might inflict violence on other people. Because if you're voluntarily going to something, maybe you already agree with them. And I think that's why it's crucial that we talk about all sorts of issues, including teen dating violence, in these general spaces where everyone, even if they might not agree with it or might not like the content, has to actually take it in, as opposed to people who are passionate and just want to help going. Because while that's great, like those aren't the people that are necessarily inflicting the harm.
Yeah, and I totally agree with what like everyone said. And I think it's important to do work at school because those young kids or young teenagers will grow up to be adults and continue that violence throughout. And if it doesn't get cut, if you don't stop the violence when it's young, it's going to continue because no one's telling them otherwise. No one's telling them what's right or wrong because it might not be shown in their household. That might be happening in their house as well. And there's no source for them to get help if it's happening to them or if they just want to get help in general. So I think school is where it starts and where we can put an end to it.
And if I could just add one thing really quickly, like to what Maya said, just going further, I mean, the people who are doing the work in like, you know, community-based programs, they already know about the issue to some extent. That's why they're joining it. By going into schools, you're appealing to this much wider scope that you just don't achieve through community-based programs. And you're talking to people who may not know about it because, like, I mean, I didn't really know that much about teen dating violence before, like, SAVE, or before my friends talked to me about that. But, I mean, still, like, there's so many people in my school who, like, I asked them, like, do you know what teen dating violence is? Or when, like, my, like, speech at the Capitol was brought up, they were like, what is that? Like, they wouldn't be able to tell you very much about that. And that's, like, a huge problem in itself. And the only way you can really counter that is by going into schools. Because, like, no matter how much you post on social media, like, join this group, like, you're just not going to achieve that wider scope that you really need to.
Yeah, totally. And I also hear what you're saying. Community-based work is important too, but why is it one or the other? Why not both? And, you know, we talk about this thing like it's called sprinkling versus saturation. I think we need to work on the term a lot. And that's kind of been used as an excuse to not do work in the schools because people will say an 8-week program is a lot more beneficial than a 1-day presentation. And it's like, sure, but we have to think bigger than that because that 1-day presentation creates 30 touch points. And those 30 people, at the very least, know something a little bit more than they did. They might talk to their friends about it, and they can get connected to those 8-week programs. I really appreciate what you all shared there, and you have a lot of expertise, and I hope that people are listening. Prevent Connect is taking this conversation even further on our social media, and we want you to be a part of the discussion. Join in on the conversation on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where we're posting excerpts from this podcast and so many more, and asking experts, practitioners, and followers like you to share your stories and ideas. Search Prevent Connect on your social media platforms to get involved. Speaking of people listening, you had quite a few people listening to you at the rally a few weeks ago at the Orange Day rally. And Armand, I heard you talking about a unified message. So I would love to hear about that message and about the prep work that went into Orange Day. What was the message that you wanted people to walk away from after all of your speeches?
For me specifically, I workshopped my speech a lot. Like, I was thinking at night when I was going to bed, how can I make this stick? And I think the way that I came across, or at least that kind of appealed to me, that I thought would like make people remember this message, is tying in the relevance right now, like in this day and age. And the way I did that was I talked about two main things. I mean, well, the first is like COVID and the two implications of that. Because with COVID, you saw like so much isolation. People relied on social media so much more. And I talked about like the negative effects that has, how social media not only spreads false information about relationships, can create like misconceptions about relationships for people just seeing like this one happy couple, you know, they're spending a day on the beach. Like that's all there is to relationships, not knowing the ups and downs of the situations, but then be literally teeming with predators. I mean, I already said this, and romanticizing sexual violence through different forms of media. Like, I don't know, like there's movies on Netflix, like 365 Days, that literally romanticizes rape. So you see so much of that. You saw so many people relying on streaming platforms like Netflix, on social media, and getting those misconceptions about relationships. And the second implication was the effect that COVID had on youth's mental health. Specifically, you saw rates of depression, anxiety, like skyrocket, like they doubled, more than that. So I mean, you see on CDC's website that risk factors for both falling victim to like any form of violence, intimate partner violence, and being a perpetrator of such violence increase when you have like higher rates of depression, anxiety, etc. So I wanted to kind of tie in the relevance of the situation right now, how COVID specifically affected this, to get people to recognize the uniqueness of the situation right now. Because just like COVID evolved with its variants, teen dating violence also evolved too. And that was the analogy that I used in my speech.
I mean, I totally agree with everything that Armand said. And I think also for me, I kind of wanted to just talk about like the real world implications and examples of how we see teen dating violence portrayed and playing out, especially even like within the walls of a school. Because I think a lot of times it's like you can talk about stats and you can talk about numbers, and those are so crucial to the message. But if your audience isn't necessarily receptive to that and they're willing to just like dismiss those numbers, I think it's a lot harder to dismiss a story. So when I was working on my speech, I just at lunch like asked a few friends, what do you wish our school or any of the schools you've been to would change in terms of how they talk about teen dating violence and sexual harassment and anything in that regard? And I think one of the most kind of troubling and just, hard things to hear from one of my friends who I used to take the bus with home every day in 7th grade was like, do you remember how we would always like zip up our jackets and like pull down our uniform skirts before we got on the bus? And I was like, yeah, I do remember that. And that was kind of what I started my speech with, because I think it just is, it's little things like that, or how there's not a day that I think I walk through the hallway where things aren't yelled at my friends or anyone going by us in the hallway. I go to an all girls school, and that's like a pretty common thing because we're co-located on the co-ed school's campus. And just like the number of lewd things that guys shout at people who they don't know, and not that if they knew it would make any difference. And I think it was just things like that, where it was like finding the small instances that very quickly, I think my friends and I have gotten used to brushing off, as have so many youth across the country and across the world. And kind of just like it doesn't have to be that way. Like we go to school to learn like pre-algebra or AP Calc or science and English. Like you don't go to learn how to be desensitized to such violence and such like horrific remarks. And I think that was kind of just what I wanted to put out there, was like, this should not be the reality that I imagined everyone who was speaking at that rally could relate to, because that's not how it should be for anyone, and especially not at a safe space like a school.
Yeah, and I agree with Maya with the statistics and how a lot of people just look at numbers, and since they can't really relate it to anyone they may know or something like that, they might just brush it off. So in my speech, I decided to say that I was one of them, like I experienced it, because I think it's really important to humanize statistics for people to really understand that it's an issue right there in front of them. And it's not some random person across the country. It's people in their area, people in their community, people in their neighborhoods, people they may know and just haven't spoken up about it. I think it's just really important to humanize numbers and statistics for the point to get across.
Thank you both for sharing your personal experiences there. I hear you, and I remember that in high school, and it sucks that you have to tell your story to a bunch of people to get them to care. And I want to recognize that bravery in both of you, and thank you for sharing your stories. And you too, Armand, what you were sharing about mental health, and Maya, what you were sharing about the culture of your school, and Anna, what you were sharing about your experience, it's all connected. And it's interesting that you shared that, because you might know the Centers for Disease Control released this really big report last week. It's called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey. They release it every few years, and it shows trends around violence and mental health and harmful behavior, all of that stuff. And unsurprisingly, the report is showing that mental health and violence amongst youth across the United States is worse than it's ever been in the report. And they included data from these past 2 years, but also from the past 10 years to show the trends. And for someone reading that report, I was like, this is proof. I mean, we know all of this anecdotally, but here's data proof that all of these things are connected. And yet I still hear adults talking about them as separate issues, right? I mean, why are you talking about mental health? I thought we're here to talk about sexual violence or relationship violence. What are you doing talking about anti-trans stuff on campus as relation to violence prevention? Like, those are two separate things. Or relating culture and behavior to experiences that people have later on. And you all said it right here, right? Like, those things are connected. We have to be working across the silos. All oppression is related, and we have to be working with an anti-oppression lens. I think it's one thing for me to say that. I think it's especially important to hear it from you because you're all living it. Is that something that you have run into doing your work with the centers that you work with? And how do you respond to that?
Personally, I don't think I've actually been asked that question, which I think is a privilege. I mean, yeah, like I don't doubt that question is asked a lot. And that's kind of what I tried to target in my speech, that like you see all these problems today, reliance on social media, this mental health crisis, and it's all connected to teen dating violence, which is what I try to do. I try to contextualize teen dating violence within this very, like, this larger scope of issues that we're facing, to show how we need added support in these arenas, because those arenas affect teen dating violence, like, are the ways that teen dating violence gets continued.
Yeah, and I agree because part of my speech, I also addressed that the fact that all these issues, social justice issues, are related. Like, gun violence prevention is related. Economic and housing justice is related. School to prison is related. So tackling one problem is going to help tackle the other problems because it's just a domino effect. So I think having those prevention efforts just cuts the domino right here and doesn't let it keep sliding and keep going for forever.
I couldn't agree more. I think luckily in my work, I don't think I've ever been asked that question either. Luckily, a lot of the organizations I work with are very big on intersectionality. And one of the things I will say that I've really taken away from it is, like, just like Anna was saying, all violence is connected. Not to like overuse that phrase, but like hurt people hurt people. Trauma and violence go hand in hand, and they lead to generational cycles that are really hard to break unless we do this, like, quite literally life-saving prevention work. And I think that's been the biggest thing, is that, I mean, I will say that, I've written certain articles, and in the comment section, people will be like, why are you talking about queer and trans right or women when this is about violence? Even if it's about gun violence. And it's like, because those things are so connected. And if you erase that part of it, you're erasing a really crucial part of why something happens or how we can prevent it from happening. And while we might be talking about teen dating violence, you have to talk about, like, gender roles, and you have to talk about drug use and mental health, because all of those things culminate in violence. And if we can stop these issues from culminating in violence, like, that's what we're trying to do. But we can't just do a kind of like you were saying with the dominoes. Like, you can't just pull out one piece and assume everything to stop. You have to make the very conscious effort to root out all of those starter pieces so that there's nothing for the dominoes to fall back on.
Yeah, there's like so many different ways or different like stories that could happen that could all lead to like the same place of being like in a violent relationship, of experiencing this violence. You could be from underfunded communities where you don't have any prevention programs, intervention. You may fall risk, or you may be yourself like a perpetrator of some sort of violence, and that leads to cycles of violence continuing later in life. Like, you're maybe like when you're an adult, you experience like domestic violence. Then what Anna said, gun violence is like super like related, because you see that 60% of all fatalities in domestic violence are from guns. So you just see so many different factors, so many different stories that all lead to the same place of being in these really bad, like, violent relationships.
I often say, and I think it makes sense why people have a hard time, especially older generations, have a hard time sitting with that larger view of anti-oppression work, because systems are so hard to change. And I think a lot of people get bogged down by that and get intimidated by that. So instead they create this narrative that it's a few evil people doing bad things. If we get rid of those evil people, then we'll be fine. And that is something that has plagued the anti-violence movement for a very long time. I have to say, it's heartening to hear that you don't get asked that question very much, because I think like 10 years older than you, and I've gotten asked that question a fair bit. And I know a person 10 years older than me who gets asked that question all the time. So to me, I'm hearing that young people have a way better understanding of this stuff than adults do, which is an even bigger reason why we need to be centering you in our prevention work if we're professional staff in this movement.
If you're looking for more content like this, head to preventconnect.org. We've got tools, guides, and resources on how to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence in your community, all for free and in one easy-to-access digital space. From live web conferences and recordings to a running blog, resource library, e-learning, and online community, Prevent Connect has everything you need to implement and evaluate innovative prevention initiatives in your community. All of that and more available for free at preventconnect.org.
Speaking of professional staff in this movement, we're going to transition to this next part of the conversation now to speak to those listeners who've asked for youth engagement topics because they're struggling with youth engagement in their communities. So I'm going to do a little role play situation. I'm going to pretend like I am a new staff person at one of those organizations like the ones that you work with, and I'm going to ask you for some advice. So if I were a brand new staff person who just started working at a local program, I want to bring youth into this work. I'm a youth engagement coordinator. I've had a couple of events. I've put it out on social media. I've invited youth, and people aren't coming, and I'm feeling discouraged. My organization has never done youth engagement work, and I don't know where to start. How can I start to get youth to come to my programs, but not just to show up? How can I engage them and share power with the youth in my communities to actually do some transformative youth leadership and engagement work, like the work that you're all doing?
I definitely think that is a complex question. And obviously, I mean, there's probably so many people who have different perspectives. For me, I see two different sides of the spectrum. One is the people who really care about this issue but may not know about it, and I would say that we just need to have more awareness about the issue in the first place, whether that means going into schools and talking about teen dating violence, talking about what how big of an issue it is, and then advocating in those school sessions, on flyers and seminars, talking about these community-based programs, the work that they're doing to get involved in youth groups. I'm sure there would be so many more people in my school engaged if you had school sessions that talked about these community-based programs. And I definitely think knowing your audience is also really important. So by talking to more youth, having more surveys, and seeing what really matters to youth, what is important, and then centering events around that, I think that would get a lot more engagement. And one of those is for people like LGBTQ youth who may not know about how big of an issue teen dating violence is, focusing on this intersectionality of the issue so that you appeal to this much broader, more diverse audience. I think the other side of the spectrum that I was talking about is, just high school youth who may need an extra edge for college applications or need volunteer hours or something like that, which, by the way, obviously you don't want it to be centered around that, but by providing incentives like that, or I don't know, by having snacks, my youth group has snacks or things like that, you may engage a type of audience that may not know much about teen dating violence or may not be very interested at first, but then, go on to learn more about it and go on to be interested about it.
I absolutely agree. I think unfortunately, sometimes throwing a label extracurricular, internship, fellowship, I do think that draws people in because, we're all stressed about trying to appear impressive on resumes and transcripts. And I think that truly though, people will grow an interest and it will become authentic, even if it starts out a little more superficial. Also snacks, like we always have pizza at our meetings, which like never hurts. But I also think that sometimes, because I've done a variety of programs and I haven't stuck with all of them. And I think kind of the number one common denominator about the programs that I have stuck with is that they really treat all of the students with respect, and like their voices are valuable. And not that the other programs are like demeaning, but sometimes it can come off a little patronizing, because sometimes it's like you walk into the room or you join the Zoom and you're kind of being talked to like you've never heard about this work before, or like you're kind of just there to like look at things before they get passed through. And it's easy to feel like your opinion isn't really valued. And I think just the number one thing is like whenever possible, make it engaging. We were all like doing Zoom school for 2 years. So whenever there's a chance to have like an actual conversation or to do something project based, I think that always is really helpful because I'm so like ready to not be looking at a computer. And I also think just like really trying to treat the students with respect from the first day to the last, making sure that it doesn't feel like school. Like, of course, there needs to be some order to things, but you know, not making it where you have to be just seated at a table for the hour until it's done. You have to raise your hand to talk, but instead making it really feel more like a community. Because once people start, I think, to make friends with the people in the group and, you know, have a good time, really get involved in the work, that's when they're going to want to stay. And suddenly, if it's called fellowship or not, isn't really going to matter anymore because they'll be so invested in the work itself.
I think a really important way to communicate with youth is talking to them like they're adults. Because if you talk to them like they're some 7-year-old kid, like Maya said, that like doesn't really know about what's going on, it can be really like, okay, well then I won't contribute to it if you think like I'm not capable of doing it. So I really do agree with like respecting a youth and treating them like they're adults, because in our youth group, I feel like we all talked like there wasn't like kids versus adults. It was like a team working together, you know? And then, like I said, snacks are always nice. People are drawn in by food. Yeah, it's like cookies or pizza.
Yeah, if I could briefly add on to what both Maya and Anna said, I definitely think having that sort of community, like that family structure is super important, so that it's not just like a meeting. Like you build a connection with this group, and that's important for a lot of youth who may not, like, I don't know, like maybe don't have as many friends or things like that. Like it's an opportunity to make friends. It's an opportunity to get to know more people. Alongside that, you definitely need like opportunities and structure, because like a lot of the groups that I don't really like as much anymore, or like the volunteering that I kind of didn't stick with, like Maya said, they weren't very structured. Like it was kind of all over the place, and I think that's something that like youth kind of need or value, is kind of a certain structure or organization. Because like if it's kind of all over the place, if you don't have set opportunities, if you don't have set like ways for youth to grow or kind of contribute to the organization more, then I mean you don't really feel like you're gaining any benefit from it. I feel like groups that were online, like the partnerships, youth support, like youth advisory group, they were great. They're definitely a great opportunity to connect people from all different parts of the state. But I do think that in-person groups are going to be way more effective because you get to know the people more and you're just much more engaged. So I definitely think valuing, now that so many things have gone online, like a lot of my classes are asynchronous, I definitely think that we need to have like more in-person connections, and I think that's definitely like a drawing factor.
My first job in this field was in a local program in San Luis Obispo, and it was a youth engagement program, and I can see all of the things that each one of you shared applies to the work that I did. So I'm hearing, one, don't get ahead of yourself. It's okay to have small beginnings. You're not going to go from no one to 20 people overnight. You're going to need to do some of that school recruitment. You're going to need to do some of those presentations, and maybe they're not in your grant deliverables, but they're going to get you there. I'm hearing share power and listen and treat youth like adults and like experts as you are. Ageism, you know, it's a huge thing in this movement. And I think, you know, the fact that a piece of this movement is rooted in that like stereotypical cis femme caretaker dynamic like doesn't lend itself to it. You know, you all are partnering with us, you're sharing your voices with us, you're collaborating with us. How can we expect you to do your part if we're not doing ours? And then finally, two more things. I'm also hearing spend the time on relationship building, add the structure, set the foundations for people to really enjoy themselves. That also makes me think about respecting your time, not expecting you to give your time when you don't have a lot of it to something that's not fleshed out. That doesn't feel good. And food, oftentimes in this work, grant dollars can't be spent on food. And the reason I'm shouting that into the ether is because it doesn't make any sense. I've run so many youth programs and food is really important, especially you all spend all your days at school. So you're going to be coming to these programs 5 or 6 o'clock at night. You should have food. And if people can't do that with their grant dollars, they should go to the grocery store or knock on some businesses' doors and ask for donations. That should be like a non sequitur right now. So you talked a little bit about this before, but I'd love to hear what other thoughts you have. Again, I'm that new person asking for advice. I want to do this the right way. What can we as adults and staff in this field do better to listen to and to center youth voices rather than tokenize the youth that we work with?
I definitely think it comes down to that like respect balance. I think youth oftentimes respect adults as they are taught from, birth. And I definitely think that is a two-way street. Adults also have to respect youth voices. And if youth feel that they're being like condescended or patronized, they're not going to feel very engaged. They're not going to feel like their opinion is valued or matters. And I think that's harmful not only to like the mental health of these youths, but also to the whole goal of the program, which is to engage more youth and find out their opinions. So I definitely think you need to have people who are skilled in relationships with youth so that, they know how to approach them. They know that like they need to value them. To keep it very simple, the other main point to center youth voices is opening the conversation like in the first place, having more opportunities like youth groups to like see partnerships group like Save's youth group. You just need to have more of those opportunities in the first place so that youth feel like, oh, this is for them, this matters.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I also think that a lot of it comes down to just like truly valuing those opinions, even if they might counter what the adult preventionists have already, even if it's already like written out and drafted out. And like, of course, there are certain times where if you're asking for a youth's opinion last minute and like it's totally different, of course you can't always accommodate that. But I think sometimes adults will ask youth things, but they don't really want their opinion. They just want to be able to like sign off on it and be like, okay, cool. Like we got the youth perspective. They're good with it. Like I can even give an example of a few weeks ago, I was at a meeting, and one of the adult leaders was like, okay, like, can you guys make some Instagram reels to connect to the youth? And one of us raised their hand and was like, yeah, like people under 18 generally don't really use Instagram reels. Like it's mostly TikTok, or like Instagram stories that people are going to click on. And the adult was like, no, like Instagram reels will be great. We were like, no, like we totally get that. But like if you're trying to connect to people who are 16, 17, like I personally have never opened Instagram reels by choice. I don't even know where I could find it on Instagram. But not to offend those over 18 who use Instagram reels. Like
so offended, Maya. I hear you. I respect you. I will just say that my job is to not currently engage 16-year-olds, and that's the excuse that I'll give myself. I don't even know where to find Instagram reels. I'm supposed to be like the cooler one, like the younger one in my organization. I'm listening to you. It's fine. I'm offended, not offended.
See, you're modeling this perfectly. This is, the ideal situation. We give feedback, you listen. So just it's things like that where it's like, even if, the youth might counter what was already planned out, to like truly take that into consideration and like plan for, okay, like not, if the youth is like, oh, I love that, great. But like, what happens if the youth is like, hey, that doesn't really work? And kind of just finding a way to balance those two things so that things get done, but also the youth feels like their opinion, as it was just now, is like actually being like taken into consideration. Because I think that's always important.
Yeah, and I totally agree, because who knows youth better than other youth, Like Maya said, like Instagram reels, not the best. I don't know. TikTok is where most kids are, and because like Instagram, what do you even do on there? Like, no offense, but like, what do you even do?
For people who can't see my face, I'm like bright red. No, this is just
I'm on Instagram. I don't have TikTok.
Thank you, Armand. No, I understand. I fully understand. My personal life, Janae, is like, wow, okay, I've aged faster than I thought that I did. But I totally get it. It's just like you're just hammering it home. You're like, Instagram sucks. And that's fine.
So yeah, I think who knows youth better than other youth, and valuing their opinions and seeing them as like another person and as an adult is just really valuable, and like believing them when they tell you things, because I know a lot of teens like express their stories or like are, because that takes a lot of courage in itself to like even just talk to someone about it. And if that person, like if that adult doesn't believe them or says things like, oh well, like maybe it was your fault, or like stuff like that, that could really like, it could also like damage their mental health, because they wouldn't really want to open up to anyone else, and it just wouldn't really go far in the prevention that they're doing. So I think like also like learning how to speak with youth and to value their opinion as a human being.
If I could add one thing, kind of different from what was talked about before, and I don't know if it exactly answers your question, but I definitely think something that is not talked about very much is like parental education. Like, I feel like a lot of parents need to know more about relationships, how to approach talking about relationships with children, and like adding on to that, how to approach teen dating violence, how to discuss that with their kids, so that like if those kids do ever unfortunately fall into situations, they're able to talk with them, or hopefully to prevent it from happening in the first place. So I definitely think like part of centering youth voices, or like centering curriculum around youth voices, needs to start with kind of talking to parents so that they're able to engage those youth voices in the first place. So that's why I was kind of saying like kind of answers the question, kind of doesn't, but
No, it totally does. And Armand, it's funny, it's because what you were sharing about parent education, I met with a program out of, I think, Wisconsin, and this is a spoiler for a later episode in this podcast series, and that's exactly what happened to them. Prevention practitioners were in the schools talking to, I think they reached like 2,000 youth in their county. They really go in hard on the schools, which is awesome. But the youth that they were working with said, why are you talking to us about this? Like, we appreciate this, but we go home and experience the complete opposite. You got to go talk to our parents, like go talk to our parents. And they went back to the drawing board and they made a parent education program because of that. And I think that's amazing. And that needs to happen more often. You know, it's like you were sharing, Maya and Anna, we can't ask for people's inputs unless we're prepared to listen to them. And that's not just youth, that's all marginalized communities. I think that's something that we talk about a lot in this movement, is we need to center marginalized communities. But what does it mean to center marginalized communities? Are we really centering them? Or are we just going to them to make ourselves feel better, to say, oh, you know, we talked to the youths and they did this, or, you know, we talked to our Latino, Latinx communities and they said this is fine, so this is fine, but you didn't center them in the designing of the programs every step of the way. And if you didn't hear any feedback at all, that might be a sign that you have more work to do, because people don't even feel safe enough to share their feedback with you. Feedback doesn't equal bad. Feedback equals a safe space.
That last point you made about like having a safe space, I think that kind of pushes the point of we need to center it around like parent education as well, because I mean, you grow up with your parents, like they're the main people in your life, and if you don't talk about relationships, if you don't talk about intimate partner violence with them, if they don't know about it and you don't know about it, how are you going to engage youth, and how are they going to feel comfortable talking about it with you, a stranger, potential stranger?
Absolutely. So, especially since we're coming up on the end of Teen Dating Violence Awareness and Prevention Month, and thinking about how we can carry this work through the entire year and not just tokenize the youth that we work with for the month of February. I would love to hear your visions for the future of this movement. Where do you think we need to go to create communities not only free of teen dating violence, but of all forms of violence?
I think the first is definitely funding for mental health resources. I mean, I've mentioned this, I don't know how many times in this podcast already, but like we are undergoing a mental health crisis. Like it's pretty plain and simple. Mental health, as already discussed, is a risk factor for both being a perpetrator or, falling prey to teen dating violence. So I think it's like extremely important to fund like mental health, to provide greater access to mental health resources for people who may not have access to them. That includes low-income communities or specifically marginalized groups, which talks about violence in this much broader sense affecting everyone. So I definitely think that's somewhere we need to go. Adding on to that, I think education in schools is something that's extremely important. I can just imagine like if we based school curriculum around relationships, or at least included it to some extent, if we had organizations like SAVE, like all the other organizations that like youth activists on this call are from, that would be incredible. That could appeal to this much broader audience so that they know what teen dating violence is, and they could, help like prevent it or intervene in the first place. And I think the last is prioritizing underfunded areas where intimate partner violence may be more prevalent due to either A, deprioritization of prevention or intervention funding, and B, community norms that may perpetuate things such as gender violence, specifically through daily oppression or taboos around dating in general, which hinder conversation in the first place. And I think an example of that is seen in the South Asian community. I mean, I am a South Asian myself, and I can just see like how much of a taboo like the concept of dating is in general. Like when I went to India, most adults are like, dating, no, like you're having an arranged marriage. Like that's already decided. And it's such a novel concept in itself that, I mean, even first gen, like Americans, Indian Americans here, they just might not feel comfortable talking about dating in the first place. So how are you even going to reach the point of talking about like dating violence?
Yeah, I totally agree with like everything he said. And I think places where we could go to create like and give like education resources could be places where people are already going for help, like Planned Parenthood or homeless shelters and schools, like we said, because kids are already going there. If you target those areas where kids are already going or they're ending up, they probably have already experienced some sort of violence in their life. And I think having those resources to help them or help other people that they may know is really valuable and really important to have everyone in our community thrive and feel safe and feel listened to.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think for me, the future hopefully looks like getting a little uncomfortable, especially in schools. I think that like at least at my school, administration is because we're a middle and high school combined. And I think administration sometimes will use the fact that we have sixth graders on campus to kind of like hide from having really serious conversations. Because it's like, oh, but it's inappropriate. What about the 11-year-olds? And it's like the 11-year-olds know what violence is. Like they go to schools where they have to think about school shootings. We had a hoax shooting earlier this year at our school, like, and they had to live through that. Like they can talk about teen dating violence. And I think it looks like that. I think like for me, I definitely can be like a people pleaser. And sometimes even in work that I'm really passionate about, I'm like, oh, but like maybe I could just email them or like, wouldn't want to make them upset or get them offended. And I think that's something that like as a movement, if we can just continue to like grow our numbers and continue to get more and more people to be involved in this, and then eventually like be able to have those conversations and realize that of course we want to be comfortable whenever possible. We don't want to hurt anyone, but also like sometimes work like this that can get controversial, even though in my opinion it really shouldn't be, that can ruffle feathers, and like so be it. And so I think just hopefully in however many months or years from now, as this movement continues to grow and get stronger, we'll just continue to have more conversations that they may be uncomfortable or awkward at first. They ultimately just further this really life-saving work.
Yeah, I think you bring up like a great point about like how some people view it as controversial, like, oh, this is like teens are way too young. Like even like how could you think teens are way too young if they're literally experiencing the violence themselves? But even like in elementary school, in middle school, it doesn't, I feel like most people have this misconception that when you talk about teen dating violence, you're talking about physical abuse. You're going to get very graphic in your descriptions, but that's definitely not the case. You don't even have to introduce the concept of intimate relations to like elementary students, to even middle schoolers, to get your point across, because relationships are so much bigger than like preventing intimate partner violence in general is so much bigger than just preventing like violence in these intimate relationships. Like it all starts out with relationships that you build from the very start. And I feel like if you prioritize education that is centered about fostering healthy relationships with your friends, with your teachers, with your parents, that's obviously going to play a very big role in preventing teen dating violence later, in preventing any form of intimate partner violence, because like it's a really, I mean, just to be plain like simple, it's a really stupid concept to think that like, oh, intimate relationships are so much different than any other relationships, because they all have like very common factors that influence each other.
1000%. I feel like I have encountered that so many times, and I continue to. I think a lot of people still don't understand what prevention means. You know, they understand like bystander intervention, they understand awareness, but what we're talking about is creating a world free of violence where people can thrive and live their best lives, no matter who they are, what their background is. In the prevention space, we're really talking about building the foundational skills to have healthy relationships with ourselves and other people. And that's age appropriate. And you can talk about those skills in different contexts, but like that on its own is not inappropriate. And it's not controversial. I think that that's something that is working against this movement, the history and the context, and almost like the women's movement of a couple decades ago. They were worried more about people pleasing, about being palatable. And there was a choice, and white women made the choice to not have the conversation about systemic violence and root causes of violence, and instead lean into this heterosexual, married, traditional relationship trope and this battered women's trope. And that was fine then. It wasn't fine, but like that went on for decades. And now we're grappling with this where we're like, that's not what we're talking about anymore. But for a lot of people, that's still their understanding. I have to say, you know, it really means a lot to me, and it's really heartening for me to see and hear you all not thinking that way, and it sounds like your peers and your friends also not thinking that way. I think that signals a change for the movement, and I hope that people listen to you. You deserve to be listened to. You have a lot of incredible insight to share with this movement, and the movement is better and would be better by listening to what you have to say and by following it. Thank you so much, Armand, Anna, Maya, for coming on this podcast and having this conversation with me. I really appreciate you and the work that you do.
Thank you so much. And thank you for this
It's
opportunity.
really great to hear from everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
You can find links to all of the things we talked about in this podcast, including the Youth in the Lead Outreach Toolkit, the YRBS survey, and more information about the Orange Day Rally and the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, linked in the description of this podcast at preventconnect.org. Like you heard come up in our conversation, creating spaces for youth to take a leadership role in prevention doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, dedication, and an agency-wide commitment to youth-centered values. In the next episode of this mini-series, we're talking to staff at the California Partnership to End Domestic Violence about how they created the Youth Advisory Board that Armand, Maya, and Anna serve on now. We're sharing our lessons learned in youth engagement from state and local programs, values we come back to, and giving concrete insight and examples for organizations looking to do similar work in their own communities. That conversation's coming up at the end of March, so make sure you subscribe to Prevent Connect and turn on your notifications so you get notified when it airs.
Prevent Connect is brought to you by Valor US and the Centers for Disease Control and made possible by listeners like you. You can find more information about this episode along with past episodes, web conferences, and blog articles at preventconnect.org. As we work to bring you more podcasts like this one, we want to hear from you. You can interact with us and suggest new topics on our Instagram in the comment section of this episode post. And if you liked this episode, make sure to like and rate this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so we can reach more listeners like you.